Chapter 31. I suppose everything I will do will also depend on my family's cooperation, Dan said following a moment of reflection.
Not necessarily, Dan, Chippewa answered. Your family is ready to follow you in whatever path you choose to take. Your wife Malou will have no need to cooperate in your desired pursuit. She and the children will simply be spectators.
But won't they have something to say in the matter?
There will be times for explanations and learning, of course. They will need similar tools to yours while they tread in your steps. They will, for example, need to arm themselves of understanding and acceptance.
That may be a difficult one, Gustavo remarked. Children are self-centered a lot of times, and understanding whatever happens to their parents is not often something they can contemplate.
Again, well said, Gustavo, Chippewa said. However, Damianos will be there to monitor their progress and will ensure that they don't fall into the traps of rebuke or annoyance.
That'll be easier said than done, Dan argued. I don't know my children yet, or I don't have any recollection of them, of course, but as Gustavo said, kids are not so cooperative when they don't or won't understand what's going on in their lives. I know, I was one of those kids. Chippewa looked at Dan for a moment before he said,
Yes, you were a recalcitrant child, but your character was forged on the basis of goodness and love, the same as your children's were.
But I had to accept a fate that I was not prepared for, Dan objected. When my father lost everything, a future I didn't want fell at my feet, and I had to accept it. I had to climb the ladder once again, and that pretty much on my own.
And did you resent your father for his loss of fortune?
Chippewa asked. No, I never resented him for anything that happened, let alone blame him. A reversal of fortune could happen to anyone, even the most astute of businessmen. I do believe he did the best he could, and I simply had to accept the situation and move on. Chippewa nodded.
I think this is a good time for you to turn to the next page of your book, Dan.
The latter threw a glance to Gustavo before he returned his gaze to the book. Go ahead, Dan, Gustavo said, grinning. I'm sure you're not going to turn into a frog now, will you? Dan had to chuckle at the remark. He turned the page and read. Since you now understand what intolerance involves, your future endeavours will call for you to find acceptance of all that occurs to you and around you. However, accepting your situation or the circumstances surrounding the event doesn't mean fatalism should invade your mind. Should you be able to accept all things for what they are or have become, you should also be able to fight for truth and knowledge. Therefore, you should be able to accept what happens to you, deal with the consequences, and fight to achieve your goals. How come it always seems to refer to the questions that we just discussed? Gustavo asked, reading the paragraph from over Dan's shoulder.
That's because Dan's mind is very much attuned to his character traits, Gustavo. There's a progress in all trains of thoughts, and Dan's book was written in accordance with his way of thinking.
I seem to remember something about this paragraph, Dan said musingly. Damianos described one of the tasks I had to accomplish. He stopped in mid-sentence. No, wait. What he said had to do with patience, but this one also triggers something in the back of my mind.
Very good of you to remember, Dan, yet in this particular instance, we're here not to recall any of your past, but to give you a future. So let's go over that paragraph again, shall we?
It says that I will have to accept everything that occurs to me. I suppose that means the circumstances in which I may find myself might be difficult to swallow, right? Chippewa nodded again.
Yes, Dan, not all is what it seems. Perhaps I could give you an example.
He waited for Dan to show his assent. He did with a silent nod.
Okay, when you woke up in that hospital in Key West, those were not the best of conditions, were they?
They certainly weren't, Dan agreed with a smile. I felt totally lost, to tell you the truth.
Precisely, but with time and a little patience, you found your way and landed in the shelter with Gustavo here, didn't you?
And you were the strangest bedfellow I ever had, Gustavo put in, chuckling. You woke up in the middle of the night screaming after Damianos, and even went to get your amulet out of your bag. Anyway, I was glad to have a new mate. Yeah, Dan added. Accepting all of what was happening to me was not easy. Once I realised I had a friend at my side, and that was there for a purpose, it became a lot easier.
That's the point, Dan, Chippewa went on. You always need an anchor to secure your boat, and this time, acceptance of what happened enabled you to move forward.
What about this fatalism the paragraph is referring to? What does that mean? Gustavo asked, throwing a querying glance at Chippewa.
Well, there is a little bit of fatalism in all of us, Gustavo. For example, when you believe that some things are inevitable, you express a form of fatalism. When you left your umbrella at home and it starts raining, you might say it was inevitable. I forgot my umbrella, therefore it had to rain.
Chippewa chuckled at the thought.
But there is a more serious aspect to fatalism that should be avoided.
Which is? Dan asked.
Which is the fact that you feel that all things that happened to you were the consequences of bad fate. It was your destiny for you to fall in that clearing, for example, and you did nothing about it. That would have demonstrated fatalism on your part.
But it was Dan's destiny to land in that clearing, wasn't it? Gustavo argued.
Yes, absolutely, Gustavo. But Dan accepted the fact and went about to redress the situation, didn't he?
At least I tried understanding it, yes, Dan agreed.
Precisely. You wanted to see the whys and the wherefores, and that is avoiding a fatalistic attitude.
When they returned to the boat, Malou and the children were surprised to find Damien and Solangi waiting for them.
Well, hello there,
Malou said as she climbed aboard ahead of Damienos and the children.
Nice to see you. It's nice to be here, Solangi said. And how are you holding on, my dear?
Well, wow, you guys are here, Daniel said as he reached the deck. Is Dad ready to go?
Daniel,
Malou interjected, a little louder than she expected.
Couldn't you say hello before you lunge headlong into your questioning?
Daniel bowed his head. Sorry, Damien, Solangi, how are you?
Hi.
Stefano and Gabby piped up in unison as they joined the little group. Hello to all of you, Damien said with a broad smile and returning his attention to Daniel. And to answer your question, Daniel, no, your dad is not ready yet, but we would like to talk to all of you before that happens nonetheless.
Do you mind if we talked up on deck? The weather is pleasant this evening. I would prefer staying in the open air. Not at all, Malou,
Solangi replied, following her and the three kids to the upper deck. Once everybody was seated, Damien said, As you know by now, you are going to follow your father in his journey toward your future. However, we need to prepare you for your trip.
See, I was right, wasn't I?
Gabby exclaimed, shooting an accusing glance to Damienos. You said we didn't have to prepare anything. The devil in me made me say that, Damienos replied, laughing heartily. You're a typical cat, aren't you? Stefano put in. Always wanting the door open when it's closed, don't you?
Absolutely, Solangi agreed. When Damienos was just a kitten, he would have me leave the door open in the middle of winter and meow to high heaven if I dared close it.
She laughed. That's what I thought, Daniel agreed. And you're still a terrible feline.
All right, children, Malou interposed. Enough teasing for now. Let's hear what Damien has to say, okay?
Everyone returned their attention to the angel. Thank you, Malou. But a little bantering here and there is good for the soul. He paused. Anyway, as I was saying, you will all need some form of preparation for the journey you're about to undertake. He looked up at Damienos. As your terrible feline mentioned earlier, Daniel, you have seen war, but your siblings had no such experiences. So Malou, Stefano and you, Gabby, will need to acquire similar knowledge. Do you mean we'll have to enlist in the army? Stefano questioned. Damien shook his head. No, Stefano, none of you will have to experience such things. Nevertheless, you will have to experience life the way your dad saw it. What do you mean by that? Gabby inquired. For one thing, you will have to forget all about using modern means of communication, all about computers, internet, cell phones, and like devices. We can't use them around here anyway, Stefano put in, so that's not much of a new experience.
We agree, Solangi said. However, being unable to use such devices and forgetting they ever existed are two entirely different things.
What do you mean by forgetting they ever existed? Malou asked. Just that, Damien said. We are here to make sure you forget the future you had, Malou. You mean wipe our memories clean? Gabby uttered, agape now. What about what we learned in school and that? Will we forget all that too? No, Gabby, all essential knowledge that you have acquired up to 2013 will remain in the back of your minds, to be retrieved when you go home. It will be like temporary memory loss then? Daniel said. Yes, Daniel. During your travels you will have no need for your previous memories, given the fact that you will forge new ones. But what about our house, our friends, and all the things we left behind? Malou asked, visibly concerned.
Do not worry, my dear, Solangi answered. Again, as Damienos explained earlier to you, Stefano, I believe, the end result will be the same or similar, but the route you take and your future as a whole will be quite different.
And when is that likely to happen? I mean, our loss of memory and all that, Gabby asked.
By the time you wake up tomorrow morning, you have forgotten most of the future as you remember it today. You will have only recollections of events or occurrences that are necessary for your progress.
What about our phones? Daniel asked. When we will be able to use them again?
Whenever you bought your current device will be the time for you to find them at your disposal,
Solangi answered. You mean we've got to spend 25 years without a cell phone? Gabby exclaimed, as if she suddenly realised what was required of them. Yes, Gabby, Damien answered. However, I will need to remind you once again that we're not on the clock here. You're living in God's time, and what may seem as a long time to you right now will only be seconds in heaven. Besides which, your mind will not recall the existence of your cell phone, so you won't have any need for such devices. Bummer, Daniel said. And how do you expect us to entertain ourselves without a computer, for example?
Oh, but computers did exist around that time, Daniel, Solangi said. But the internet wasn't accessible to the public until much later. And if it's games you're referring to, they were only available on floppy disks for the people who had personal computers.
Haha, Damien chuckled. You, son, will need to return to the books and to playing games with your family. You mean like Monopoly and such? Stefano asked. Yes, and such as so many others, Damien replied.
Besides,
Solangi put in,
you won't have time for much entertainment, I believe.
She shot a glance at Damien.
Right?
Damien nodded. So whenever you're ready to retire for the night, we will be ready to do what God has asked us to do.